First outline, write a 800 words. They arrived like a parade I never ordered. Black Escalades and glossy BMWs nosed to tail up the gravel, dust boiling behind them until the sky looked bruised. Doors opened and the uniforms of city confidence spilled out. Heels that sank into the dirt, suits too sharp for pine sap, clipboard smiles. Karen, the HOA president, floated to the front, manicured and grinning like she'd just seized a beachhead. She threw her arm toward my cabin as if it belonged to her and announced a dream investment to the dozen agents trailing behind. I watched from the porch, coffee steaming in a chipped mug, and knew the circus wouldn't bow out politely. I set the mug down and walked to the gate. The chain was already looped. All it needed was resolve. I snapped the heavy padlock shut so hard the sound carried down the valley, the links rattling like punctuation. Then I unfurled what I'd painted the night before on canvas big enough to stop a truck. Private land. No trespassing. Tour canceled. I strung it across the post just as the first realtor gasped, her jaw faltering mid-smile. Karen's grin stiffened into plaster. The wind made the banner crack like a flag, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was its flutter and the slow idle of luxury engines. I leaned into the quiet and said, "Tour's over before it begins." Karen clicked forward, heels stabbing at the gravel, and hissed through the bars that this was HOA property. I almost laughed. From my back pocket, I pulled the folded deed, pressed it against the chain link so everyone could read the county stamp, and told her plainly that unless she planned to purchase a lawsuit, the best direction today was reverse. A slick-haired agent tried to slip a business card through the gap like a truce. I let it fall into the dust, a white square sinking into the road like a surrender flag no one asked for. I hadn't come unprepared. Weeks earlier, I'd bolted a steel sign to the post, County Surveyor Verified Boundary, and I pointed to it like a compass that never lies. Red lights winked from the trees where my cameras watched, and I told them every second was being recorded. I'd already spoken with the sheriff, I said. As long as I stayed calm and hands-off, the law would do the talking. Karen threatened to call the police. "Please do," I told her. "Coffee will be ready." The agents shifted in their polished shoes, their smiles curdling as they realized this wasn't a champagne ribbon cutting but a trespass seminar they didn't sign up for. Then, the valley added insult to their injury. My neighbor's goats, curious as gossip, wandered down to see the fuss. One nibbled at a leather briefcase. Another took a dignified bite from a tripod. Phones came out. Shutters clicked, and the tableau Karen had staged as a glossy sales event sagged into farce. I leaned on the post and let the laughter ripple. I didn't raise my voice or my hands. I let stillness do the work. The more I refused to flail, the more her control slipped. You could see it in the agent's eyes. A thin film of embarrassment becoming awareness, becoming doubt. By day's end, their confidence had bled into awkwardness. Engines started, doors thudded, and one by one they retreated down the way they'd come. Dust, now a curtain closing on a play that never opened. It should have ended there. Instead, the next morning brought the second act. Slick flyers slipped into mailboxes claiming my land was penciled for community development. Aerial photos circled in red like a prosecutor's exhibit. A drone buzzed the tree line, dipping low to peep over my roof as if a document angle could invent a violation. I flicked the floodlights and watched it wobble away. An annoyed wasp denied sugar. By afternoon, a handful of agents staged a survey at the fence. I parked my truck across the road and called the sheriff on speaker. The deputy said it plain, "No HOA jurisdiction here." Shoulders fell. Tape measures recoiled. They slipped back into their cars and the dust finally drifted away from me. By the next morning, the lie machine was humming. Flyers appeared in mailboxes like dandelion seeds, stamped with grainy aerial shots of my cabin, ringed in aggressive red circles and lines about community development rights that simply did not exist. Two men in polos traced my fence with cameras, calling it an exterior survey, confident in the way people are when they've been promised they're untouchable. A drone buzzed into the canopy and sank low enough to skim the porch rail, as though it could conjure a violation with the right angle. I didn't chase it. I flipped on the floodlights I'd wired for just such a stunt and watched the lens flare back at its operator, the craft lurching away like a moth losing the porch bulb. My cameras in the pines digitized every second, That afternoon, I drove to the cafe with a stack of their flyers and a quiet request. Old Tom tapped one with a leathery finger and said they'd tried the same playbook on his cousin's farm. Others nodded, voices low but steady. By sunset, I had names, dates, and neighbors willing to testify that Karen's authority had long been a performance in search of an audience. Karen preferred volume to substance, so when soft pressure failed, she brought a clipboard chorus back to the gate and read out a litany of supposed violations: unauthorized signage, hazardous fencing, unsightly storage. I stayed on the porch, camera LEDs blinking red in the trees, and let her words pile up where the dust did. When she demanded I accept the notice, I told her to let the county deliver it. I only take law from the people who write it. One board member flinched at that and looked at his shoes. She left in a storm of gravel, and not long after, a white envelope arrived with an offer from a buyer consortium, dangling double the price I'd paid. No names, no signatures, just bait to see if greed could do what intimidation had not. I warmed the cabin with it, flames licking the bold numbers until they curled and blackened and became nothing more than heat in a room already full of it. When the weekend rolled around, the show got a costume change. A rented minibus coughed up a crew of agents dressed for rustic adventure. Hiking boots fresh from a store floor, polos in earth tones, the whole curated charm of a city tour pretending to be wild. They fanned brochures at the gate and pointed at the lake as if they were already writing listing copy. I stood on the porch with an axe in my hand, not in warning, just in rhythm with the woodpile I was stacking, and watched the chatter dull to murmurs. Karen arrived last, all gesture and grin, launching into a speech about potential and access like she was unveiling a resort. I whistled. My neighbor's goats trotted in on cue, bleating, tugging at tripods, and chewing the corners of glossy brochures. Laughter snuck out of throats, trying hard to stay professional. Then the county inspector's truck eased in, and everything changed key. He shook my hand, tested my chain locks, read my signage, and took his time. When he finished, he spoke loudly enough for every camera to catch it. Full compliance, exemplary fencing, nothing out of order. You could feel the air go out of Karen's sales pitch like a punctured tire. Two agents folded their tripods without looking at her. Another stared at the ground like he'd left the oven on. I made sure that moment didn't evaporate. I asked the inspector in front of them if he had received the drone photos and harassment reports I'd submitted. He nodded, said they were logged. The words drifted through the group like a weather change. Nobody who lives on commission wants their name rumored alongside trespass and harassment, no matter how gilded the brochure. Back at the cabin, I synced my camera feeds and backed them up twice, then drove copies to the county office with a list of dates, times, and the names I could reasonably attach. The sheriff called that evening, voice even but firmer than before, to say he'd reviewed the incidents and that his patience was thinning. He reminded me to keep doing exactly what I was doing, document, don't engage, and promised he'd be less diplomatic if the next report mentioned tools at the gate instead of cameras in the trees. It was the kind of call that doesn't make you relax so much as straighten your spine. Over the next days, the recoil was visible. Agents who had strutted up my road now called to disavow the fiasco, billing Karen for wasted time and refusing future listings. Board members stopped showing up. With the sheriff less patient and the county on record, her circle tightened, then thinned, and the momentum slid decisively our way. Dawn crept in on a low fog that turned the pines into pale ghosts, and with it came the sound of engines. More than one, more than a neighbor's truck, the kind of layered rumble that crawls into your chest and tells you trouble is organizing itself. When the mist thinned, I saw them. A Lexus at the front like a captain's hat, followed by moving trucks big enough to swallow a living room in one bite, and behind those a few SUVs idling with their headlights nudging the fog. Men in gloves and matching t-shirts climbed out slowly, the way people move when they're not sure whether they're on the right job. Karen stepped from the Lexus in a blazer that belonged on a podium, not a gravel road, a stack of papers in her hand as if paper could substitute for jurisdiction. She announced across the locked gate that the cabin would be cleared for community use today, that I could either cooperate or face charges. The words hit the air with the brittle clang of something counterfeit pretending to be steel. I walked down to the gate with my breath fogging and the ground crisp under my boots. I didn't bring a speech. I brought the same things I'd brought every day since this started. A deed in my pocket, cameras in the trees, and calm as a weapon Karen could never quite figure out. I told the movers, not unkindly, that crossing the fence would be trespassing, that the sheriff knew the lay of this land, and that every second was on camera. Karen waved her papers at me like a spellbook and declared she had a court order. I asked to see it. She pressed a sheaf against the chain link, trembling just enough that the pages rattled. The formatting was wrong, the signatures out of place, the whole packet screaming home office printer. I shook my head and said the county would have stamped anything real. She didn't like that answer. 2 movers were told to bring crowbars. They hesitated, looked at each other, then at my cameras, then stepped forward anyway because a contract and a paycheck can dull better instincts. The road turned white when I hit the switch, and a floodlight poured daylight onto the scene. The men froze with their hands halfway to the metal. From the trees, tiny red LEDs blinked like steady heartbeats. I let the silence do the heavy lifting for me. Then I dropped the secondary cattle grid behind the gate, heavy steel slats sliding into place with a finality that echoed. It wasn't drama, it was engineering. If fear is a door, preparation is the deadbolt. Karen marched up to the chain link and hissed names at me, squatter, thief, disgrace, as though volume could stand in for jurisdiction. I pointed past her at the men shifting on their feet and told them to ask themselves if this was a job worth a night in a cell and a line on a permanent record. One of them dropped his crowbar. Another backed away, palms up as if to show he hadn't touched anything. Karen spun and shrieked at them like they were wayward children, promising to sue her own hires if they didn't obey. Desperation makes poor theater. Then she did the thing that stripped the last bit of polish from the performance. She climbed back into the Lexus, revved the engine, and edged the car toward the ditch beside the gate where the ground sloped and the brush parted just enough to tempt a bad idea. She tried to slip around the fence the way a stream tries to find the smallest weakness in rock. The front wheels dipped, the undercarriage scraped, and the car lodged with a grinding yelp so loud the birds fled the tree line. She tried to rock it free, tires spitting mud, but the Lexus only sank deeper until it looked like an animal half swallowed by the earth. The movers laughed in the restrained way people do when the person paying them has just made a fool of herself. Her board members stared at their shoes like prayer might rewind time. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up as if the valley had summoned it. He stepped out with the measured patience of someone who's seen every brand of foolishness and doesn't plan to add commentary. Karen launched into her script, illegal occupation, fraudulent deed, emergency authority, and shoved her papers at him. He took one look and said what everyone else already knew. These weren't legal. No stamp, no case number, no standing. The air thinned. He turned to the movers and told them plainly that crossing the gate would be trespass. He turned back to Karen and listed what he'd seen over the past weeks. Falsified filings, harassment, attempted forced entry under color of authority. It wasn't a lecture. It was a ledger. She tried to speak again, but the words fell apart before they could organize themselves into a defense. A tow truck arrived, its winch whining as it pulled her car out of the ditch like a fish unhooked with visible regret. The spectacle was almost merciful, freeing the Lexus from its own bad decision. Her entourage had already begun to evaporate, melting into SUVs and rolling back down the road with their headlights suddenly very interested in the gravel. The men in gloves declined to make eye contact. The board members mumbled about rescheduling, and Karen stood beside the rutted ditch like a queen whose crown had slipped into the mud. The sheriff told her she was free to leave, and that the next time she came up this road with a convoy, she should expect to leave with more than a tow bill. Then he nodded at me, not a smile exactly, but something close to respect, and headed back to his cruiser. When the engines faded, the fog began to lift properly, and the light came in clean and steady. I raised the gate's chain a notch and checked the lattice of steel like a farmer tapping fence posts after a storm. I downloaded the morning's footage twice, once to a hard drive, once to a cloud folder I'd labeled with the date, and I wrote a short email to the sheriff with timestamps and still frames attached. None of it felt like triumph in the cinematic sense. It felt like tightening a bolt on a bridge you cross every day, an act of maintenance on a life someone else had tried to reroute. Yet it was a turning point all the same. The raid had taken her power and stripped it of pretense, left it sputtering in a ditch for a tow truck to drag away. The people who had followed her up my road saw something they couldn't unsee. Not a leader enforcing order, but a bully gambling on theater and losing in front of a camera. After that morning, every time a rumor drifted through town or a letter with too formal wording landed in a mailbox, it hit air that was thinner and colder. You can only pretend to have authority until the day you try to turn the key, and the lock doesn't move. That was the day the lock held, and the story changed. The courthouse smelled like old paper and varnished wood, the kind of air that suggests history has a habit of repeating itself until someone makes it stop. And I sat at the oak bench beside my lawyer, a steady man who'd been untying land knots longer than I'd been chopping wood at the cabin, while across the aisle Karen perched in a perfect posture that couldn't hide the way her eyes kept skittering, a bird trapped behind glass. A few reporters clustered in the back with pads ready. Neighbors slid into pews with the hush of people who had waited a long time to see a bully called to the front of the class, and then the judge entered, gavel kissing the block with a crack that settled the room like dust in sunlight. My lawyer opened with the clean line of a surveyor's chalk. Deeded property in my name. Boundaries certified by the county, the HOA with no jurisdiction, and a pattern of harassment dressed up as community enforcement. Karen's lawyer countered with air, phrases about standards, cohesion, development potential, and bylaws, until the judge leaned forward and asked the one question that mattered. Did the HOA have any legal document tying my parcel to their subdivision? Silence walked into the room. Karen rifled a too-thin folder, produced a pair of maps I recognized from weeks of nonsense, and handed them up. The judge scanned them for seconds, frowned, and said, "These are not valid filings." He asked where they came from. Her mouth moved, but the answer didn't form before the murmurs in the gallery did. The county inspector went first, called by my lawyer, and his testimony drew a straight line through the fog. Fence checked, signage correct, compliance verified, and an attempted override by clipboard that carried as much legal weight as a grocery list. He even recounted, to a ripple of laughter, how Karen had tried to cite me for a woodpile under a tarp. Then the sheriff took the stand and brought the mourning of the moving trucks into the record. His voice, even as he described the convoy, the orders to hired muscle, the bogus paperwork he'd rejected on site, the stuck Lexus, the warnings issued. He didn't editorialize. He itemized. With each answer, the judge's face set a little harder, like a craftsman testing a joint he already knew was flawed. When I took the stand, I left the anger on the bench and told it straight. The day I bought the cabin, the weeks of escalation from flyers to drones to staged tours, the simple fact that I wanted quiet and legal boundaries while Karen wanted a resort brochure to come true. I showed the banner in a photograph, explained the cameras in the trees, and when the judge asked why I had recorded everything, I said because escalation was both likely and predictable, and I wasn't going to meet theater with force when evidence would do the job without breaking anything. You could feel that land in the room, not as bravado but as foresight, a decision to let the facts carry their own weight. Then my lawyer uncapped the bottle he'd been saving. Board meeting minutes, obtained through public records requests, signed by Karen, laid out in the language of strategy rather than stewardship, realtor outreach, forced compliance, repositioning parcel for community gain, and the one line that drew an audible intake of breath. Once enough pressure is applied, owner will sell or abandon. The county clerk authenticated the minutes and the submission IDs. You could watch color drain from Karen's face like ink pulled from paper with solvent. Realtors followed, reluctant but resolute, testifying that they'd been told the cabin was part of an upcoming listing, that they'd brought clients to a locked gate and goats in a banner, and left humiliated. One admitted he'd been offered a bonus to move a buyer quickly if he could just get past the optics. The OA surveyor, a man who looked like he wished the floor would open, testified, under subpoena, that he'd been paid in cash and pressured to redraw boundaries, and the official county map was set beside his to let the discrepancies shout for themselves. Karen stood abruptly, voice pitching sharp enough to scratch paint, and accused the system, the court, the clerk, me, anyone and everyone of conspiracy. The bailiff stepped forward with a hand like a stop sign and guided her back to her seat, then out when the words kept boiling. Pens in the back scratched faster. The judge didn't need to thunder. He did what real authority does. He summarized the record. The HOA had no standing over my parcel. The documents offered in defense were not valid. The conduct described by witnesses, including law enforcement, was troubling enough to invite consequences beyond property disputes. He took motions under advisement with a promise to rule promptly, but the room already knew where the river was running. We walked out into a sun hot enough to rebuke the varnish smell still clinging to my jacket. And by the time I reached the parking lot, texts were pinging neighbors, the sheriff, the inspector, even an apologetic agent or two. Each a small stone dropped into the same pond. The story had tipped. I drove back the long way, let the lake flash through the trees like a coin you keep flipping only to find it still lands true. And when the cabin came into view, the banner tugged in the wind. No longer just cloth and paint, but proof that a simple boundary, held with patience and receipts, can outlast a tower of bluster. Voices don't go quiet overnight, Karen's least of all. But after that day, whatever noise was left had lost its echo. The law was now printed on the page, our receipts bound into the record, and the valley, which had been listening from behind shut windows, began to open them. The days after court moved with the soft rhythm of a valley catching its breath, but the quiet had a tautness to it, like canvas stretched tight over a frame. Word trickled through the cafe that Karen had filed an emergency injunction, one last attempt to drape authority over a boundary she couldn't touch. By evening, 2 sleek sedans rolled up to the gate, and men in suits announced themselves as counsel for a consortium of stakeholders, their sentences polished to a shine meant to blind. I didn't raise my voice. I pointed at the cameras, said the sheriff had copies of every forged filing, and asked whether they wanted their names archived alongside a story the local press had already chewed on. They traded glances, recalibrated their confidence, and retreated, promising it wasn't over in the same tone people use when they know it might be. That night, the banner tugged at the wind like a ship's flag at anchor, and the cabin felt less besieged than watched over. The cracks inside the HOA widened into fractures you could see from the road. An anonymous envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address, just a thick stack of printed emails. Board members scolded Karen in their own words. Funds wasted, reputations dragged, meetings hijacked by fury. One even proposing a vote to strip her title. I scanned the pages and locked them in the safe, not to weaponize them, but to acknowledge the tide. Fear, once their organizing principle, had thinned into embarrassment and self-preservation. Not long after, the cowardice turned nocturnal. I heard footsteps brush the fence line near midnight and caught 2 figures in my flashlight beam crouched by the corner post, one gripping a can of spray paint, the other a hammer. They bolted as soon as the light hit them, crashing through brush to a waiting car. I emailed the sheriff, who called back with tired patience and promised extra patrols. You could tell he was past the stage of warnings and into the ledger of charges. Karen, clinging to what stage she had left, called a community meeting and invited cameras to restore transparency. I went and sat in the back, arms folded, and watched the room fill with neighbors who'd spent years lowering their voices on porches, conditioned to toe invisible lines. She took the podium and said the court had erred. The county had misread. The crisis was about protecting property values from renegades. The words hung for a moment. Then a man stood up and asked why HOA funds had hired movers for a dawn raid. Another asked if she had forged signatures. She dodged, insisted process had been followed, and a woman in the back rose and said, "We read the transcript. You lied." The line stamped itself on the room. What had once been murmurs became questions with teeth. When she left the stage, it wasn't to applause or even polite silence, but the buzz of revolt. A few days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox claiming to be from the county clerk, ordering me to vacate in 60 days while my deed was reviewed. No seal, no signature, only the stale breath of fraud. I drove to the clerk's office with the paper in hand. He read it, snorted, and called it what it was. He also copied it for an investigation he said was already overdue. The end came not with shouting, but with a county truck and 2 suits who carried their authority like a level across a beam. They stood by the gate and told me, matter of fact, that the investigation was complete. Forged documents, harassment campaigns, misuse of funds. The HOA was dissolved by county order. Accounts frozen, board stripped of power, Karen barred from leadership going forward. They weren't here to ask. They were here to inform. The news leapt from phone to phone like a spark racing dry grass. Pickups slowed to honk and wave. Someone dropped off a basket of bread with a note that read, "About time." Even the goats seemed to approve, nosing past the fence like they understood that a gate can be protection or prison, depending which side writes the rules. That afternoon, Karen came alone. She looked smaller, not by inches, but by unraveling. No papers, no entourage, just a question. Why fight so hard? Why not sell? I leaned on the bar and told her land wasn't just square footage. It was belonging, work, memory. She frowned, said it wasn't fair, and left with no more theater than a door closing. Later, I heard she'd packed up her certainty and left town. In the weeks that followed, the valley reset itself like a jar of water settling after a hard shake. Without fines and threats, shutters brightened to colors nobody had dared. Kids left bikes scattered on lawns without paying for it. Laughter climbed the hill in the evenings. A Saturday barbecue grew from 3 neighbors to 30. Old Tom tuned his guitar and flames painted the lake in gold while we passed plates and easy stories. Reporters kept calling, and one ran a photo of me under the banner with a headline I didn't love, but couldn't quite hate. The sheriff stopped by now and then to talk about fishing and to mention, in the way a friend looks out for you, that vigilance isn't paranoia once you've earned it. The county posted notices confirming what the court had made plain. Residents would manage their own properties directly. The bylaws that had strangled the valley were officially relics. I thought about taking the banner down more than once. Each time someone rolled by, honked and yelled, "Leave it." So it stayed. The cloth had outlived the fight and become a story in itself, a shorthand for a principle so simple it feels old-fashioned. The truth is a boundary, and if you stand on it long enough, the storm spends itself. Some evenings I sit with coffee and watch the breeze tug those letters, remembering the day the SUVs came with their certainty and their cameras, and found instead a gate, a deed, a quiet refusal. The road is still gravel. The lake still throws coins of light through the trees. The peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of a line held steady,